Hey family, welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. A patient asked me to call her husband. 5 minutes later, my own husband answered the phone. For a second, Agnes Carter thought she had read the paperwork wrong. People make mistakes all the time. Hospitals make mistakes. Computers make mistakes. Tired nurses definitely make mistakes. But what would you do if you looked down at a patient's emergency contact information and saw your husband's name? Not a similar name, not a common name, the exact phone number, the exact address. What would be going through your mind? Would you assume the worst? Would you confront him immediately? Or would you do exactly what Agnes did? Call the number, because that's what she did. And when the call connected, a familiar voice answered. Hey, sweetheart. The moment those two words reached her ears, everything Agnes thought she knew about her marriage began to crack. But family, if you think this is a story about cheating, stay with me. Because the truth waiting at the end of this story is far stranger, far more emotional, and far more life-changing than either Agnes or Claire could have imagined. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Like this video, comment below and tell us honestly, if you were Agnes, what would your first reaction be? And if you're new here, subscribe to the family. Every like, every comment, and every subscription helps YouTube share these stories with more people. Now let's begin. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark, and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video ends. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here, wrapped in immersive narration that lets you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. Agnes Carter had worked enough emergency room shifts to know that ordinary nights could become unforgettable in a matter of seconds. At 29 years old, she was one of the most dependable nurses at one of Dallas's busiest hospitals. Patients trusted her. Doctors respected her. New nurses followed her lead. When things became chaotic most nights, Agnes moved through the emergency department with the calm confidence that came from years of experience. This particular Thursday started no differently. The emergency room was packed. Monitors beeped continuously. Phones rang from multiple stations. Patients filled nearly every available room. A child cried somewhere near triage. A doctor hurried past carrying a chart. Another ambulance had just arrived. For hospital staff, it was simply another busy night. Agnes adjusted her gloves while reviewing a patient's chart. Across the nurse's station, a colleague was trying to calm an anxious family member. Someone called for additional supplies. Someone else requested assistance in trauma. The controlled chaos felt familiar, comforting even. Because in emergency medicine, routine often existed inside disorder. Agnes was updating notes when the doors burst open. Paramedics pushed a stretcher through the entrance. Their expressions immediately told everyone nearby that this patient required urgent attention. Female, approximately 30 years old, one paramedic reported, while moving quickly beside the stretcher. Vehicle collision, significant impact, loss of consciousness at scene. The trauma team responded immediately. Agnes joined them without hesitation. Training took over. Questions, vitals, assessments, instructions. The woman on the stretcher had dark braided hair that had partially come loose during the crash. A small cut marked her forehead. Bruising was already beginning to form near her shoulder. Her breathing remained steady. That was a good sign. Still, nobody relaxed. Not yet. The patient's identification eventually confirmed her name, Claire Brooks. For hours, Claire remained unconscious while doctors monitored her condition. Thankfully, scans revealed no catastrophic injuries, painful injuries, serious injuries, but survivable, the kind of outcome emergency room staff celebrated quietly. Around midnight, Claire finally opened her eyes. The room had become calmer by then. Several lights were dimmed. The worst of the rush had passed. Agnes happened to be the nurse standing beside her bed when she woke up. Claire blinked several times, confused, disoriented, trying to understand where she was. "You're in the hospital," Agnes said gently. Claire swallowed. "What happened?" "You were involved in a car accident." Claire stared at the ceiling for a moment, processing, remembering. Then concern suddenly crossed her face. "My phone." Agnes shook her head. "It didn't survive the accident." Claire immediately looked worried, not about herself, not about her injuries, about someone else. "I need to call my husband." The request sounded completely normal. Patients asked for spouses every day. Agnes nodded reassuringly. "Do you remember his number?" Claire's face tightened. "No." She closed her eyes briefly. "It was saved in my phone." "That's okay." Agnes offered a small smile. "We can pull your emergency contact information from registration." Relief appeared on Claire's face. "Please." Agnes reached for the paperwork attached to the chart. A simple task, one she had performed hundreds of times before. She flipped through the pages, located the emergency contact section, and looked down. At first she thought fatigue was affecting her concentration. The name didn't make sense, so she read it again, then again. Jeremy Carter, her husband's name. Agnes stopped breathing for a second. Jeremy Carter, not similar, not close, exact. Her eyes moved lower. The phone number, her husband's phone number, every digit matched. A cold sensation traveled through her chest, slowly, uncomfortably. Then her eyes reached the address, their address, the home she shared with Jeremy. The paperwork suddenly felt heavier in her hands. The room felt smaller. Claire noticed the change immediately. "Is something wrong?" Agnes couldn't answer, because she genuinely didn't know. Maybe there was an explanation. There had to be. There absolutely had to be. Without responding, Agnes stepped into the hallway. The noise of the emergency room seemed distant now. Muted, she stared at the page, then looked at the number, then back at the page. Finally, with trembling fingers, she pressed call. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Her heartbeat seemed louder than everything around her. Then the call connected, and a familiar voice answered. "Hey, sweetheart." Agnes froze. The voice belonged to Jeremy, her husband, and at that exact moment, every certainty she had about her marriage began to change. Seconds. Agnes simply stood there. The phone remained pressed against her ear. The hallway around her continued moving as if nothing had happened. Nurses walked past. Doctors discussed patients. A family hurried toward the waiting area. Life continued. Yet Agnes felt completely disconnected from it. Because Jeremy had answered. Not another Jeremy. Not someone with a similar voice. Her Jeremy. The man she shared a home with. The man she kissed goodbye before every shift. The man she trusted more than anyone. "Agnes?" Jeremy sounded concerned now. "Everything okay?" She couldn't find the words. Her eyes drifted toward Claire's room. Claire was watching through the glass, waiting, confused, unaware that her request had just shattered the peace Agnes had spent years building. "Agnes," Jeremy repeated. This time she ended the call. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing. Her hand slowly lowered. For a moment she considered walking back into Claire's room and demanding answers. "Who are you? How do you know my husband? How long has this been going on?" But years of nursing had taught her something important. People revealed more when they didn't know what you knew. So instead Agnes returned to work, at least physically. Mentally she was somewhere else entirely, because every memory she had of Jeremy suddenly felt different. Not wrong, different, and that frightened her. The rest of her shift passed in a haze. Every patient interaction felt automatic. Every conversation sounded distant. Every quiet moment brought another memory, another detail, another question. By sunrise, Agnes found herself replaying the story of how she and Jeremy met. A story she had always loved. Now she wasn't sure what to think. 3 years earlier, she had just finished one of the worst overnight shifts of her career. She was exhausted, running on caffeine and stubborn determination, the kind of exhaustion that made simple tasks feel complicated. All she wanted was coffee, a large coffee, maybe 2. She pushed through the entrance of a small coffee shop in Dallas without paying attention, which was exactly why she walked directly into a glass door. Not a gentle bump, not a slight mistake. A full-speed collision. The sound echoed through the entire shop. People turned immediately. Someone gasped. A teenager laughed. And one man nearly dropped his coffee trying not to laugh himself. That man was Jeremy. Agnes still remembered the embarrassment, the burning sensation in her face, the desire to disappear. What she remembered even more was Jeremy walking over, not to mock her, to make sure she was okay. "You survived," he had said. Agnes stared at him. "Barely," Jeremy smiled. That door never stood a chance. She should have been annoyed. Instead she laughed, against her better judgment. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. The second conversation lasted longer. The third lasted even longer. Soon they were finding excuses to meet. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became dinner. Dinner became entire weekends spent together. Jeremy wasn't flashy. He wasn't the type of man who tried to impress people. He owned a construction company, worked hard, talked straight, and somehow always made people feel comfortable. That was what Agnes loved most. She never felt like she had to pretend around him. 3 years later, they were married. Not because everything was perfect, because it wasn't. Jeremy left cabinet doors open, every single time. Agnes constantly complained about it. Jeremy forgot where he left his keys almost daily. Agnes never let him forget that. She stole blankets while sleeping. Jeremy complained about that, frequently. They argued about television shows, vacation destinations, home projects, and whose turn it was to wash dishes. Normal marriage stuff, real marriage stuff, the small imperfections that made life feel authentic. Yet now, sitting in her car after leaving the hospital, Agnes found herself questioning everything. Because once suspicion enters a relationship, it changes how memories look. Moments that once felt harmless suddenly seem important, and there were moments, several of them. The first appeared about 8 months earlier. Jeremy had started taking certain phone calls outside. Not all of them, only some. At first, Agnes barely noticed. Construction work involved clients. Clients created problems. Problems required calls. That seemed reasonable. But eventually she started paying attention. Whenever she casually asked who called, Jeremy always gave similar answers. Work, job site issue, client question. Nothing detailed, nothing specific. Just enough information to end the conversation. At the time she accepted it. Now she wasn't so sure. Then there were the bank withdrawals. Those bothered her even more. Not because the amounts were huge, because they were consistent. A few $100s here, a few hundred there, money quietly disappearing. One evening she had noticed the activity while paying bills. Jeremy was grilling chicken outside. Music played softly from the backyard. The smell of barbecue drifted through the open door. It should have been a peaceful evening. Instead, Agnes stared at their banking app, confused. Jeremy eventually walked inside carrying a plate. "You look worried." She turned the phone toward him. "What are these withdrawals?" For the briefest moment something crossed his face. Not panic, not exactly, just surprise. Then it disappeared. "Work expenses," he said. Agnes frowned. "Again?" Jeremy laughed softly. "You're making that sound suspicious. It is suspicious. It's construction. That's not an explanation." Jeremy pointed toward the grill. "The chicken is burning." Agnes turned instinctively. Jeremy used the distraction to change the subject. At the time she thought it was funny. Now it wasn't funny anymore. Now it looked different. Everything looked different. There were other moments too. Late-night drives, unexpected errands, times when Jeremy claimed he needed to meet someone regarding a project. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough to create doubt. And doubt was dangerous, especially when combined with a patient named Claire, especially when that patient's paperwork listed Jeremy as her husband. By the time Agnes pulled into her driveway that morning, her stomach felt heavy. Not because she knew the truth, because she didn't, and uncertainty could be worse than bad news. As she sat in her parked car, one realization settled heavily inside her chest. Every strange phone call, every missing dollar, every vague explanation, every unexplained absence. They no longer looked like random events. They looked like evidence. And for the first time since meeting Jeremy outside that coffee shop 3 years earlier, Agnes found herself asking a question she never imagined she would ask. What if she never really knew her husband at all? The sunrise over Dallas arrived quietly. Most people welcomed mornings. Agnes dreaded this one. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed to last forever. Every mile gave her more time to think, and thinking was becoming a problem. Because the more she replayed the events from the hospital, the more impossible everything felt. A patient had asked her to call her husband. The emergency contact information belonged to Jeremy. The phone number belonged to Jeremy. The address belonged to Jeremy. And when she called, Jeremy answered. No misunderstanding could explain all of that, at least not one she could see. By the time she reached home, exhaustion sat heavily on her shoulders. Her shift had ended, but her nightmare felt like it was just beginning. Jeremy's truck was already parked in the driveway, a sight that usually brought comfort. Today it made her nervous. She sat inside her car for nearly a minute, just staring at the house, trying to prepare herself, trying to decide what to say, trying to decide whether she even wanted to hear the answers. Finally, she grabbed her bag and walked inside. The smell of fresh coffee greeted her immediately. Jeremy stood in the kitchen, wearing sweatpants, holding a mug, looking exactly like the man she'd left the night before. The sight almost frustrated her, because people hiding double lives weren't supposed to look this normal. "Morning, beautiful," Jeremy smiled. The familiar greeting hit differently now. Agnes forced a smile. "Morning." Jeremy tilted his head slightly. Something in her voice caught his attention immediately. "You okay?" Such a simple question. Yet it almost broke her, because she wanted to ask 100 questions of her own. Who is Claire? Why are you listed as her husband? How long has this been happening? What haven't you told me? Instead, she swallowed all of it. Years of nursing had trained her to observe before reacting, and right now she needed information more than confrontation. "I'm just tired." Jeremy studied her face. For a moment she wondered if he knew, if somehow he could see everything written across her expression. but he simply nodded. Long shift? Very. Go get some sleep. Then he stepped forward and kissed her forehead. The gesture was gentle, natural, completely normal, and that made everything worse, because guilty people weren't supposed to act this comfortable. Were they? Agnes walked toward the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the mattress. Sleep never came. Questions did. Hours passed. By afternoon she had reached a decision. She needed facts. Not guesses, not theories, facts. The investigation began that same day. At first she felt guilty. Jeremy was her husband, not a criminal. But every time guilt surfaced, another image appeared. Claire's paperwork, Jeremy's voice, the emergency contact form. And suddenly the guilt disappeared. Agnes started with something simple, their bank records. She opened their online account and began reviewing months of transactions. Then more months, then even more. At first nothing stood out. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, normal expenses. Then she started noticing patterns. Withdrawals, repeated withdrawals. Not huge amounts, but frequent. A few $100s, sometimes more. Always occurring every few weeks, always withdrawn by Jeremy. Agnes grabbed a notebook. Started writing dates, amounts, locations, trying to connect the pieces. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Thousands of dollars had disappeared over the last 2 years. Not enough to destroy them financially, but enough to matter. Far more than Jeremy had ever mentioned. Her stomach tightened. She kept going. Next came credit card statements. Again, she expected something obvious. Hotels, restaurants, gifts, evidence. Instead, she found something stranger. Medical facilities, laboratories, specialists, pharmacies, repeated charges linked to healthcare services. Agnes frowned. That didn't make sense. She wasn't sick. Jeremy wasn't sick, at least not that she knew of. So who were these expenses for? Claire immediately entered her mind. The possibility made her chest tighten. Was Jeremy paying her medical bills? Why? What kind of relationship required that level of support? The questions only multiplied. The following evening, Agnes examined something else, phone records. She wasn't looking for conversations. She couldn't see those. But she could see patterns, numbers, durations, frequency. And once again, something appeared. One number showed up repeatedly, month after month, year after year. Not daily, not constantly, but consistently. The number belonged to someone Jeremy contacted often. Agnes copied it down, then stared at it. Her pulse quickened. Because she already knew who it belonged to, Claire. She had seen it in the hospital file. For several moments, Agnes simply sat there, silent. The evidence felt overwhelming. Every discovery pointed in the same direction. Every answer created new questions. Yet one thing still bothered her. Nothing fit perfectly. Affairs usually followed predictable patterns. Secret dinners, romantic trips, private messages, late-night hotel charges. She wasn't finding any of that. Instead, she kept finding medical expenses, appointments, payments, healthcare records. It felt less like a romance, and more like a responsibility. The distinction mattered. But she didn't know why, not yet. The following night, while Jeremy showered upstairs, Agnes continued searching. This time she examined archived financial records. Older records, much older. And that was when she found something unexpected. A recurring payment, small, monthly, consistent. The transaction description caught her attention immediately. North Texas Community Medical Foundation. Agnes frowned. She had never heard Jeremy mention it. The payment stretched back years, long before Claire's accident, long before the strange hospital paperwork, long before any of this started. That discovery changed everything, because suddenly there was a second mystery. If Claire wasn't the beginning of this story, then what was? Agnes leaned back in her chair, thinking, processing, trying to make sense of the growing puzzle. The hospital records, the medical expenses, the hidden payments, the foundation donations, the phone calls, the withdrawals. None of it connected cleanly. Yet somehow she felt closer to the truth. Or maybe she was only getting deeper into confusion. Upstairs she heard the bathroom door open. Jeremy was finished showering. Normal life continuing. As if nothing had changed. As if her marriage wasn't balanced on a question she still couldn't answer. Agnes quickly closed her laptop. But one thought refused to leave her mind. Jeremy was hiding something. Of that she was now certain. The bigger question was whether Claire was hiding something too. And as she stared toward the staircase, Agnes made a decision. The next time she saw Claire Brooks, she wasn't leaving without answers. The next morning, Agnes arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Not because her shift required it, because she couldn't stop thinking about Claire. The drive to work had been quiet. No music, no podcasts, just thoughts. Questions, possibilities. Every scenario seemed to lead back to the same woman recovering several floors above the emergency department, Claire Brooks. By the time Agnes reached the nurse's station, she had already made one decision. She wasn't going to confront Claire yet. Not until she knew more. Not until she understood what she was walking into. For now, she would watch, listen, pay attention, the same way she did with patients every day. Hours later, Agnes finally stepped into Claire's room. Claire looked noticeably better. The bruising remained visible. The cuts were healing. Color had returned to her face. She was sitting upright reading paperwork when Agnes entered. "Good morning," Agnes said professionally. Claire looked up and smiled. "Morning." The smile was warm, natural. Nothing about it felt deceptive. That bothered Agnes more than she wanted to admit, because she wanted Claire to look guilty. Wanted some obvious sign, some clue. Something that would make all of this easier. Instead, Claire simply looked grateful to be alive. Agnes checked the monitors, reviewed medications, recorded observations. The silence stretched longer than usual. Eventually Claire spoke. "You look tired." Agnes didn't look at her. "Long week." Claire nodded. Hospital people always say that. Agnes almost smiled. "Almost. I guess we do." Claire folded her paperwork. "You should take care of yourself, too." The comment caught Agnes off guard. Most patients focused on themselves. Claire seemed genuinely concerned. It felt strange. The conversation ended there. But as Agnes walked out of the room, she noticed Claire watching her. Not suspiciously. Curiously, as if she sensed something had changed. Because something had. The following day brought more of the same. Another shift. Another visit. Another awkward interaction. The tension wasn't obvious. Nobody else would have noticed it. But both women felt it. Agnes entered carrying medication. Claire thanked her. Agnes checked vitals. Claire asked about the weather. The conversations remained polite, safe, carefully controlled. Neither woman addressing the question hanging between them. During one visit, Claire looked toward the television. A daytime game show was playing. The contestants were celebrating wildly over a prize that wasn't particularly impressive. Claire laughed. "I don't understand game shows." Agnes adjusted in four-line. "Why not?" Claire pointed at the screen. "If somebody gave me $50,000 right now, I'd cry." Agnes laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh. Short. Unexpected. Claire immediately noticed. "There it is." Agnes looked up. "What? You finally laughed." Agnes shook her head. "Don't get used to it." Claire grinned. Too late. For a brief moment the tension disappeared. Then reality returned. And Agnes remembered exactly who she was talking to. The woman connected to Jeremy. The woman whose number appeared repeatedly in phone records. The woman receiving help he never mentioned. That evening, Agnes found herself standing outside Claire's room longer than necessary, watching through the small glass window, thinking, trying to reconcile two completely different versions of Claire. One version existed inside her suspicions. The other existed in front of her. And they didn't match, not even a little. Claire didn't behave like someone hiding an affair. She didn't flirt, didn't ask about Jeremy, didn't act possessive, didn't display any sign of secret intimacy. Nothing. The absence of those signs should have reassured Agnes. Instead, it confused her. Because if Claire wasn't what Agnes expected, then what was she? The next afternoon, Claire answered that question with one of her own. Agnes was updating a chart near the bed when she noticed Claire studying her. Not casually, carefully, as if she had reached a conclusion. Finally, Claire set aside her magazine. "Can I ask you something?" Agnes kept writing. "Depends." Claire smiled faintly. "That's not encouraging. Ask anyway." A few seconds passed. Claire seemed to choose her words carefully. Then she spoke. "You've been different since the night I woke up." Agnes's pen stopped moving. Only for a moment, but Claire noticed. "You were friendly before." Claire's voice remained calm. "Now you're distant." Agnes returned to the chart. "I'm a nurse." Claire nodded slowly. "I know." Silence. Then Claire added quietly, "And I don't think that's the reason." For a moment neither woman spoke. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Agnes could feel her pulse quickening. Claire looked nervous now. Not defensive, not angry, nervous, as though she was stepping into unfamiliar territory. Then she asked the question that stopped everything. "Is this about Jeremy?" And just like that, every wall Agnes had been trying to maintain suddenly felt much harder to hold. The question lingered in the room. Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. "Is this about Jeremy?" Claire's voice wasn't accusatory. It wasn't defensive either. If anything, she sounded uncertain. Like someone trying to understand why a familiar room suddenly felt unfamiliar. Agnes slowly placed the chart on the counter beside the bed. For several seconds she said nothing. Years of experience had taught her how powerful silence could be. Most people rushed to fill it. Claire didn't. She simply waited. The steady beep of the monitor became the only sound in the room. Finally Agnes spoke. "Why would you ask that?" Claire looked down briefly, then back up. "Because every time his name comes up, something changes." Agnes felt her stomach tighten. Interesting, very interesting, because Claire had just confirmed something important. Jeremy's name had come up before, not often, but enough for her to notice a reaction. Agnes pulled a chair closer and sat down. No nurse, no patient, just two women sitting in a hospital room, trying to make sense of something neither fully understood. "When was the last time you spoke to Jeremy?" Agnes asked. Claire looked surprised by the question. She thought for a moment. "A few weeks ago." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Agnes noticed. "What did you talk about?" Claire's eyebrows lifted. "That's a strange question." "Answer it." Claire shifted slightly against the pillow. The movement wasn't comfortable. Neither was the conversation. "He checked on me." Agnes remained silent. Claire continued. "He does that sometimes." Agnes studied her face. Every expression, every pause, every reaction, looking for cracks, looking for guilt, looking for something, anything. But Claire didn't seem nervous about Jeremy. She seemed nervous about Agnes. And that distinction mattered. "You talk often?" Agnes asked. Claire hesitated. "Sometimes." "How often is sometimes?" Claire gave a small laugh. Not because anything was funny, because she seemed uncomfortable. "You're making this sound like an interrogation." "Maybe it is." The words slipped out before Agnes could soften them. The room immediately became quiet. Claire stared at her, confusion slowly replacing caution. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of becoming defensive, Claire looked concerned, genuinely concerned. "Asking about Jeremy isn't really the problem, is it?" Agnes crossed her arms. "What do you mean?" Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, thinking, connecting pieces. Then she asked softly, "What exactly do you think is happening?" Agnes almost answered. Almost. But something stopped her, because saying it out loud would make it real, and despite everything she discovered, part of her still hoped she was wrong. Claire waited. When no answer came, she looked toward the window. The Dallas skyline was visible in the distance. Traffic moved steadily below. Normal life continuing. Far away from this conversation. Finally, Claire looked back at Agnes. Then she said something that completely caught her off guard. "You're Agnes, aren't you?" For a second, Agnes forgot how to breathe. The words landed like a punch. Not because Claire knew her name, because Agnes had never told her. Not once. Not ever. The room suddenly felt colder. Agnes slowly sat forward. "How do you know my name?" Claire's expression changed immediately. The moment she realized what she'd said, regret flashed across her face. A brief mistake. But the damage was done. "You know who I am." Agnes's voice became firmer. "How?" Claire swallowed. For the first time since this conversation started, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not guilty, not frightened, just caught off guard. "Claire," Agnes held her gaze. "How do you know my name?" A long silence followed. The kind that stretches far longer than it actually lasts. Finally, Claire answered, "I've heard Jeremy talk about you." There it was. The sentence Agnes had been dreading. Every suspicion immediately rushed back. Every fear, every late-night theory, every unanswered question. All of it. Claire watched the reaction spread across Agnes's face, and immediately realized how bad that sounded. "No," she shook her head quickly. "Not like that." Agnes almost laughed. Almost. Because what other way was there? Claire noticed the disbelief, the frustration, the growing anger, and suddenly she looked exhausted, emotionally exhausted, as if she had spent years carrying something heavy, something she never expected to explain. "I think we're having two different conversations," Claire said quietly. Agnes stood. "No." Her voice remained calm, but only barely. "I think we're finally having the same conversation." The tension between them tightened. Claire looked confused. Agnes looked determined, neither woman willing to back down. Finally, Agnes asked the question she'd been carrying since the night of the accident. The question that had been sitting in her chest for days. The question she needed answered. "What exactly are you to Jeremy?" Claire stared at her. Several seconds passed, then several more. The answer never came. At least not immediately. Instead, Claire looked completely stunned, as if she had just discovered something herself. A realization, a misunderstanding, a connection she hadn't seen before. Slowly she leaned back against her pillow, her eyes never leaving Agnes. Then she whispered, "Oh." The single word carried more emotion than an entire speech, because suddenly Claire understood. She understood the tension, the coldness, the distance, everything, and judging by her expression, she wished she didn't. Agnes folded her arms, waiting, demanding, needing answers. Claire closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. What appeared in them wasn't guilt, it wasn't shame, it wasn't fear. It looked remarkably like sadness, and that confused Agnes more than anything else, because sadness wasn't the reaction she expected. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Agnes." She paused, searching for words, carefully choosing them. Then she said, "You don't understand what Jeremy really did for me." And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Agnes wasn't sure whether that sentence made her feel better or much, much worse. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Agnes remained standing beside the hospital bed. Claire remained leaning against her pillow. The silence between them felt different now, not hostile, heavy, because whatever Claire was about to say had clearly been sitting inside her for a long time, and judging by the expression on her face, she wasn't sure where to begin. Agnes crossed her arms. "You keep saying things like that." Claire looked up. "Like what? You don't understand. You don't know the whole story. Jeremy did something for me." "Tell me." Claire lowered her eyes. A humorless smile touched her face. "If it were that simple, we wouldn't be sitting here." Agnes didn't respond. She wasn't interested in riddles. She wanted facts, the kind that either saved a marriage or destroyed one. Claire took a slow breath, then another. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. Softer, more personal, as if she wasn't talking to a nurse anymore, or even to Jeremy's wife. She was talking about a version of herself she rarely allowed anyone to see. 5 years ago, Claire said quietly, I was living in my car. Agnes blinked. The answer wasn't what she expected, not even close. Claire looked toward the window. The Dallas skyline stretched beyond the glass, bright, busy, full of movement. A completely different world from the one she was describing. I used to park in different places every night. A faint smile appeared, not a happy smile, the kind people wore when remembering difficult times. You learn quickly when you're sleeping in a car. Agnes remained silent, listening. Claire continued. Some parking lots are safer than others. She looked down at her hands. You learn which gas stations stay open all night. You learn where security officers are more likely to leave you alone. A pause. And you learn how cold a car gets at 3 a.m. The room became quiet. Agnes found herself slowly lowering her arms. Claire wasn't speaking dramatically. She wasn't trying to gain sympathy. If anything, she sounded matter-of-fact, like someone describing weather she had already survived. What happened? Agnes asked. Claire laughed softly. The sound carried no amusement. Which part? The question hung in the air, because clearly there was more than one answer. Claire adjusted the blanket covering her legs, then continued. I grew up in foster care. Agnes felt something shift inside her. Claire wasn't telling a story. She was explaining a life Agnes knew nothing about. I moved around a lot. Claire stared at the wall. Different homes, different schools, different people, different promises. A faint smile touched her face. I got pretty good at packing. Agnes looked down briefly, then back up. Claire wasn't asking for pity. That somehow made it harder to hear. When I turned 18, everything changed. Claire's voice remained steady. At least that's what everyone told me. Agnes already knew where this was going. The confidence, the independence, the freedom. People loved talking about those things. Reality was usually different. Claire nodded slightly, almost as if she could hear Agnes thinking. They said I was finally on my own. Another small laugh. They forgot to mention how expensive being on your own actually is. The room grew quiet again. Outside the door, hospital staff moved through the hallway. Inside, neither woman paid attention. Claire continued. I worked jobs, lost jobs, found new jobs, lost those too. Her eyes drifted downward. And eventually I ran out of places to stay. Slowly, because she could hear how close Claire was getting to the hardest part. Claire sat quietly for a moment, gathering herself. Then she spoke again. I found out I was pregnant. The words landed gently, yet somehow they carried enormous weight. Agnes looked at her, really looked at her. Not as a suspect, not as a mystery, as a person. Claire smiled weakly. I wish I could tell you I handled it well. She shook her head. I didn't. For the first time, emotion appeared clearly in her eyes. Not tears, something deeper, old pain, the kind people learn to carry because they don't have another choice. I was terrified. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I didn't have a home. I barely had money. I didn't know what I was doing. She laughed once, short, broken, and I was responsible for another human being. Agnes felt her chest tighten, because suddenly she could picture it. A young woman, alone, pregnant, sleeping inside a vehicle, trying to survive one day at a time. Claire stared out the window, remembering. There were days I skipped meals. There were nights I couldn't sleep. There were mornings I honestly didn't know what I was going to do next. The room remained silent. Then Claire smiled unexpectedly. A small smile, the kind that appears when someone remembers a turning point. A community outreach event changed everything. Agnes immediately noticed it. The shift, the memory seemed different, warmer, safer. Claire nodded to herself, as if revisiting that night. I almost didn't go. She laughed softly. The only reason I showed up was because somebody mentioned free food. For the first time, Agnes almost smiled. Claire noticed. Trust me. She pointed toward herself. I wasn't there to make friends. Another brief silence followed. Then Claire's expression softened, and Agnes already knew whose name was coming next. That's where I met Jeremy. The room felt still. Not because Agnes was surprised, because this was the part she had been waiting for. Claire continued. He was volunteering. No speeches, no attention, no big performance. He was just helping. Agnes listened carefully. Every word mattered now. He handed me a bag of supplies. Claire smiled faintly, and somehow started a conversation. The memory clearly amused her. He asked questions. I answered maybe half of them. Agnes finally spoke. And? Claire's smile grew slightly. And he kept showing up. The answer arrived so naturally that Agnes almost missed its significance. Claire looked down. He noticed things. What things? Agnes asked. The things most people avoid noticing. Claire's voice softened. The exhaustion. The fear. The fact that I was pretending everything was okay. Agnes remained quiet. Claire looked toward the ceiling, thinking, remembering. Then she smiled sadly. Most people saw a problem. A pause. Jeremy saw a person. The words settled between them. Simple. Honest. Powerful. Agnes didn't know what to do with them, because nothing Claire had described sounded like an affair. Nothing. Not even close. Yet there was still too much missing. Too much unexplained. Claire seemed to know exactly what Agnes was thinking, because her expression suddenly changed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by caution, immediately, as though she had reached a line she wasn't willing to cross. Agnes noticed. What happened next? Claire looked away. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. What happened after that? Agnes asked again. Claire shook her head. No, Agnes frowned. No? A sad smile appeared. I can't. The answer immediately frustrated her. What do you mean you can't? Claire looked genuinely apologetic. Because she wasn't refusing out of stubbornness. She was refusing because she had already made a decision long ago, and she intended to keep it. Agnes stepped closer. Claire, no. Claire's voice remained gentle, but firm. I can't tell you that part. Why? For several seconds, Claire simply looked at her. Then she answered, quietly, honestly. I promised him I wouldn't. The room fell silent. Agnes stared at her. Every instinct immediately returned, because whatever Claire had just revealed was only part of the truth, not all of it, not even close. And if Jeremy had asked her to keep something secret for all these years, then the real story was much bigger than Agnes imagined. Much bigger. As Agnes stood beside the bed, one realization settled heavily inside her chest. She had finally received answers, but somehow those answers had only created an even larger mystery. And for the first time since this began, she became certain of one thing. Jeremy Carter was hiding something far more significant than she had ever suspected. Claire's words stayed with Agnes long after she left the hospital. I promised him I wouldn't. The sentence followed her all the way home, through traffic, through dinner, through the quiet hours of the night. Most people didn't keep promises like that for years, especially not promises involving someone else's husband, which meant whatever Jeremy was hiding wasn't small, it wasn't casual, and it certainly wasn't recent. The next morning, Agnes found herself sitting at the kitchen table before sunrise. Jeremy was already gone. A construction project on the other side of Dallas required an early start. Normally she would have appreciated the empty house, Today it gave her an opportunity. Her laptop sat open in front of her, coffee cooled untouched beside it, and spread across the table were months of financial records. She had looked at them before. Now she was looking differently. Not for evidence of an affair, for evidence of a secret. There was a difference, a significant one. Agnes opened another year's worth of statements. Then another, then another. Her eyes moved carefully across transaction histories, searching for patterns, searching for consistency, searching for anything she might have missed. The answer appeared almost immediately. Medical payments, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. The more she searched, the more she found. Specialists, testing centers, prescriptions, diagnostic facilities, appointments, treatments, expenses stretching back years, far longer than Agnes originally realized. She leaned closer to the screen, her heartbeat quickening, because the numbers were becoming impossible to ignore. A few $100s here, several hundred there. Then larger amounts, much larger. One charge alone exceeded $3,000, another surpassed $4,000. The total continued growing. $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. Eventually, Agnes stopped calculating, because she already understood the answer. Jeremy hadn't spent hundreds helping someone. He had spent tens of thousands, quietly, without recognition, without mentioning it, without asking for credit. Agnes sat back in her chair, stunned. Whatever this situation was, it clearly meant more to him than she had ever understood. The discovery didn't answer her questions, but it changed them, because affairs usually involve taking attention, taking affection, taking time. This looked different. This looked like giving, constantly, consistently, for years. Hours passed. The morning sunlight gradually filled the kitchen. Still she searched. Still she followed the trail. Then another pattern emerged. The North Texas Community Medical Foundation. The same organization she had noticed earlier. Monthly donations, small at first, then larger still. Never enough to draw attention, always enough to matter. The payments never stopped, month after month, year after year. Agnes opened another statement, then another, and another. The foundation kept appearing. At one point she pulled out her phone and searched for information. The foundation provided assistance to families facing major medical expenses, transportation assistance, medication assistance, emergency support, housing support during treatment. Agnes stared at the description. A strange feeling settled over her, because suddenly she could see connections. Claire, medical expenses, foundation donations, Jeremy. The pieces weren't fully assembled, but they were moving closer together. For nearly an hour she sat quietly, thinking, reviewing, calculating, trying to determine exactly how much money Jeremy had spent over the years. The answer shocked her, far more than she expected, far more than most people would ever contribute, especially without telling anyone, especially without discussing it with their spouse. She closed her eyes briefly, not out of anger, out of confusion, because the man she thought she knew kept becoming more complicated. Not worse, more complicated. A short time later she opened one final archive folder, the oldest records available. She wasn't expecting to find anything important. Most investigations eventually reached a dead end. Most trails eventually disappeared. Instead, she found the single transaction that changed everything. Agnes stared at the screen, then blinked, then looked again. The date was impossible to ignore. It happened years earlier, long before Claire's accident, long before the phone call, long before the hospital records, long before any of the events currently consuming her life. The payment had been made to the same medical foundation, the exact same one, only this time the date stopped her cold, because it predated every known connection to Claire. Agnes immediately checked another record, then another. The same result appeared. The donation started before Claire entered the picture, before any medical expenses connected to her, before any of it. The realization sent a chill through her. She slowly leaned back, thinking, if Jeremy's involvement began before Claire, then Claire wasn't the beginning of this story. She was part of it, maybe even an important part, but not the beginning, which meant an entirely new question had just appeared. Who had Jeremy been helping before Claire? The house suddenly felt very quiet. Agnes stared at the screen, the numbers, the dates, the years, all of it pointing towards something much larger than she imagined, something deeper, something older. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Agnes realized she might have been investigating the wrong mystery. Because whatever secret Jeremy was protecting, it didn't start with Claire Brooks, not even close. For the rest of the day, Agnes couldn't focus on anything else. The discovery kept replaying in her mind. The medical foundation payments, the years of donations, the enormous amount of money, and most importantly, the fact that it all started before Claire. That single detail changed everything, because if Claire wasn't the beginning of the story, then Agnes had been looking in the wrong direction the entire time. By the time Jeremy arrived home that evening, Agnes had reached her limit. No more theories, no more investigating, no more searching through records. She wanted answers, real answers. The sound of Jeremy's truck pulling into the driveway made her heart race. She stood near the kitchen window watching him climb out. The same work boots, the same dusty jeans, the same tired walk after a long day. A sight she had seen hundreds of times. Tonight it felt different. Tonight she wasn't waiting for her husband. She was waiting for the man who had been hiding years of secrets. A few moments later, the front door opened. Jeremy stepped inside carrying his lunch cooler. "Hey," his smile appeared automatically, then disappeared, because he immediately noticed something. Agnes wasn't smiling. The kitchen felt unusually quiet. Jeremy slowly set the cooler on the counter. "Okay," he looked at her carefully. "What's wrong?" Agnes folded her arms. "We need to talk." Those 4 words were enough. Jeremy's shoulders dropped slightly, not dramatically. Just enough to suggest he knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Jeremy pulled out a chair, sat down, waited. Agnes remained standing. "I know about the payments." Jeremy looked up. No panic, no anger, just silence. The medical bills, still silence. The foundation donations. Jeremy exhaled slowly. Agnes continued, "Tens of thousands of dollars, Jeremy." The words echoed through the kitchen. "You never told me." Jeremy rubbed his jaw, thinking, searching for the right response. Unfortunately, Agnes was no longer interested in careful responses. "I deserve an explanation." Jeremy nodded. "Yes." The answer surprised her. No argument, no excuses, just yes, "I do." Agnes waited. Jeremy stared at the table for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than usual. "How much did you find?" Agnes laughed in disbelief. "That's your question?" Jeremy looked tired. Not physically, emotionally, like someone carrying a weight for too long. "How much?" he repeated. "Enough." A painful silence followed. Jeremy nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair. For a moment he looked older than 40, not because of age, because of memory. Because whatever he was about to say clearly lived somewhere deep inside him. Finally he spoke. "When I was a kid, things got bad." Agnes remained silent, listening. Jeremy rarely talked about his childhood, not because he was secretive, because he preferred focusing on the present, the future, not the past. "My dad lost his job." His voice remained calm. "We thought it would be temporary." A small smile appeared. "It wasn't." Agnes sat down across from him. The anger she'd carried into the conversation hadn't disappeared, but something else had joined it. Curiosity. Jeremy looked toward the window, remembering. The bills started piling up, the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. The usual stuff. Agnes watched him carefully. This wasn't a prepared story, she could tell. He wasn't performing, he was remembering. "There were days my parents thought we were going to lose everything." His voice softened. "I didn't understand most of it at the time." A faint laugh escaped him. Kids rarely do. The smile faded. "But I remember the stress. I remember the arguments. I remember pretending to sleep so I wouldn't hear them." The room became quiet. Jeremy stared at the table, lost somewhere years away. Then his expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for Agnes to notice, because now he was remembering something good. "One Saturday morning somebody knocked on our door." Agnes listened. "My mom answered." A pause. There were groceries on the porch. Jeremy smiled faintly. No note, no explanation, just groceries. Agnes felt her chest tighten. Jeremy continued. "The next week it happened again." Another pause. "And again." His eyes drifted toward the ceiling. As time passed, more people helped. Some gave food, some paid bills, some offered work, some just checked on us. His voice became emotional for the first time. Not enough to lose control. Enough to feel real. Nobody asked for recognition. They just showed up. Agnes watched him quietly. The kitchen had become completely still. Jeremy smiled sadly. "My parents never forgot it." His eyes met hers. Neither did I. The sentence landed heavily, because Agnes suddenly understood part of the picture. Not all of it. Part of it. Jeremy leaned forward. When you grow up receiving kindness like that. He shrugged slightly. You don't forget. Agnes lowered her gaze. For a moment she remembered Claire's words. Most people saw a problem. Jeremy saw a person. The two stories fit together. Perfectly. Too perfectly. Which meant Claire had been telling the truth. At least part of it. Agnes looked back up. That's why you helped Claire. Jeremy nodded. Partly. The answer immediately caught her attention. Partly. Not entirely. Partly. Meaning? Jeremy looked away. And there it was. The hesitation. The same hesitation Claire had shown. The same invisible wall. Agnes recognized it immediately, because she'd already run into it once. Jeremy. His jaw tightened. What aren't you telling me? The silence that followed felt endless. Jeremy stared at the floor, thinking, struggling, choosing. For several seconds Agnes genuinely believed he was finally going to tell her everything. Instead he shook his head, a small movement, but a devastating one. No, Agnes blinked. No. His eyes met hers, filled with regret, filled with apology, filled with something else too. Determination. I can't. Frustration immediately surged through her. Why not? Jeremy looked exhausted, because clearly he knew how unfair this felt. He knew exactly what he was asking. Trust me. Without explanation, without answers, without proof. Agnes stood. You owe me more than that. I know. Then tell me. Jeremy closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the answer hadn't changed, and neither had his resolve. For several moments neither spoke. Finally Jeremy broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Because it wasn't my secret to tell. The words hit Agnes harder than any argument could have, because suddenly Claire's refusal made sense. The same wall, the same protection, the same promise. Whatever the truth was, both of them were guarding it. And as Jeremy sat across from her, looking more conflicted than she had ever seen him, Agnes realized something terrifying. The secret wasn't being hidden to protect Jeremy. It was being hidden to protect someone else. Agnes barely slept that night. Jeremy's words followed her into the darkness, because it wasn't my secret to tell. The sentence frustrated her. Not because she believed he was lying. Because she was beginning to believe he wasn't. That was what made everything so difficult. If Jeremy had been cheating, this would have been easier. Painful, but easier. At least there would be a clear villain, a clear explanation. Instead, every answer seemed to create more questions. And now both Jeremy and Claire were protecting the same secret. By morning, Agnes knew exactly what she needed to do. She needed to see Claire. One more conversation, no assumptions, no accusations, just the truth. The full truth. When Agnes arrived at the hospital later that day, Claire was sitting near the window. The bruises from the accident continued to fade. The cuts were healing. She looked stronger than she had a week earlier. But the moment she saw Agnes walk into the room, her expression changed, because she immediately understood why Agnes was there. Neither woman bothered pretending, not anymore. Agnes closed the door behind her. Claire watched quietly. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally Agnes broke the silence. I talked to Jeremy. Claire lowered her eyes. The reaction confirmed everything. She already knew that conversation was coming. What did he say? The same thing you did. Claire sighed softly, a tired sigh, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. Agnes leaned forward. I need the truth. Claire stared at her hands, then toward the window, then back at Agnes. Several emotions crossed her face. Conflict, fear, relief. Because deep down she seemed tired of protecting this secret, tired of watching it hurt people. Finally she spoke. He told you it wasn't his secret. Agnes nodded. Yes. Claire smiled sadly. That sounds like Jeremy. The room grew quiet again. Then Claire surprised her. For the first time since this entire situation began, she looked directly into Agnes's eyes and said, You deserve to know. Agnes felt her heart begin to race. Claire took a slow breath, then another, gathering herself, preparing, because what she was about to reveal had been hidden for years. You remember when I told you I was pregnant and living in my car? Agnes nodded. Claire continued. Things got worse before they got better. Her voice remained steady. But barely. I was trying to survive. I was trying to prepare for a baby. I was trying to pretend I wasn't terrified. A faint smile appeared. The pretending part didn't work very well. Agnes listened quietly. Claire looked down, then continued. When my son was born, I thought the hardest part was over. The smile disappeared. It wasn't. The room became still. Claire folded her hands together. He was only a few months old when the medical problem started. Agnes immediately straightened in her chair. Because this was new, entirely new. Claire's eyes filled with old memories, the difficult kind. The doctors weren't sure what was wrong. We spent months going from appointment to appointment, test after test, hospital after hospital. She swallowed. The bills started arriving before we had answers. Agnes felt her chest tighten. Claire continued. I was working, trying to keep a roof over our heads, trying to keep food on the table, trying to keep my son healthy. Her voice cracked slightly. Only slightly. I was failing at all three. The words hung heavily between them. Claire looked away, embarrassed by the admission, not because she had done something wrong, because survival often comes with guilt people don't deserve. Agnes remained silent, giving her space. After a moment, Claire continued. Jeremy was still helping? A pause. He drove us to appointments. He helped with paperwork. He sat through meetings I barely understood. Agnes could picture it. Jeremy showing up. Again, and again, and again. The way Claire described it made one thing obvious. This wasn't romance. It was commitment. A different kind of commitment. The kind people rarely talked about. Claire wiped at one eye, then laughed softly. You know what makes me angry? Agnes shook her head. What? I never even thanked him properly. The comment caught Agnes off guard. Claire smiled sadly. Because every time I tried, he changed the subject. For the first time, Agnes almost smiled too. That sounded exactly like Jeremy. Claire looked down, then continued. The worst day came during another hospital emergency. Her expression darkened. The doctors needed immediate decisions. I was being treated. My son was being evaluated. Everything happened at once. The memory clearly still affected her. Even years later, I didn't have family. The words came quietly. No parents, no relatives, no one. She took a breath. And the only person I trusted enough to make decisions if something happened to me. Claire stopped. The room became completely silent. Agnes already knew. Before the words arrived, she knew. Claire looked directly at her and finally said it. Was Jeremy. For several seconds Agnes couldn't speak. Claire continued gently. Not because we were together. Not because we were involved. Not because there was some secret relationship. She shook her head. No. A tear finally slipped down her cheek. Because he was the only person who never left. The room felt smaller, warmer, heavier. Every assumption Agnes had built over the last several weeks began collapsing. Not dramatically, quietly, one piece at a time. Claire continued. The hospital needed emergency documentation. They needed someone authorized to help if I couldn't. Agnes listened carefully. Every word mattered now. Jeremy agreed. A pause. He became my emergency guardian. The sentence settled heavily between them. Not husband, not boyfriend, not affair partner, emergency guardian. The distinction changed everything. Claire laughed softly through tears. The paperwork was entered years ago. Another pause. Then copied, then transferred, then copied again. Agnes immediately understood. Hospital systems, merged databases, old records, human error. It happened more often than people realized. Claire nodded. The mistake followed us everywhere. The wrong relationship field, the wrong designation. Nobody ever fixed it. Suddenly the emergency contact form made sense. The phone number, the address, everything. Agnes sat back slowly, trying to absorb it all. The room remained quiet. Neither woman rushed to speak. Finally Claire looked at her, a small smile appearing, sad but genuine. I never wanted you to think that. Agnes lowered her eyes, because for the first time since this entire situation began, she understood. Not just the facts, the people, the emotions, the history. All of it. The woman she believed was destroying her marriage had actually been protecting it. Protecting Jeremy, protecting a promise, protecting a story that wasn't hers to tell. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Then a knock interrupted the silence. Both turned toward the door. A doctor stepped into the room. The expression on his face immediately changed the atmosphere. Professional. Serious. Focused. Claire noticed it too. The small smile disappeared. The doctor glanced toward her chart, then back toward her. "Claire," he said gently, "we need to discuss your latest test results." The room instantly grew quiet. Something in his tone felt different, important. Agnes felt it immediately. So did Claire. The doctor stepped further inside. "Can you come with me?" Claire's face slowly tightened, not with panic, with concern, because deep down she already knew. Good news rarely arrives sounding like that. And as she rose from the bed, neither woman realized that the conversation waiting ahead was about to change all three of their lives forever. The doctor waited until Claire was seated before speaking. Agnes remained nearby, not as a nurse, not even as Jeremy's wife, just as someone who suddenly cared what happened next. The small consultation room felt much quieter than the busy hospital outside. Claire sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The movement seemed unconscious. A person preparing for bad news before hearing it. The doctor reviewed several pages inside a folder. His expression remained professional, careful, measured. The kind of expression medical professionals often wore when delivering information that could change someone's future. Claire noticed it immediately. "So it's not good news." The doctor looked up. He didn't answer right away. That hesitation alone told her enough. Agnes watched Claire's shoulders stiffen slightly, not dramatically, just enough to reveal the fear she was trying hard to hide. Finally, the doctor spoke. "We received the latest results from your testing." Claire nodded, waiting. The doctor continued. "Your heart condition has progressed faster than expected." The room became silent. No dramatic reaction, no sudden tears, just silence. The kind that arrives when a person hears something they were hoping never to hear. Claire looked down at the table. For several seconds she said nothing. Agnes could almost see her processing the information, trying to place it somewhere inside her mind, trying to understand what it meant. Eventually, Claire lifted her eyes. "How much worse?" The question came quietly. The doctor answered honestly, not brutally, not gently, honestly. "The medications are no longer controlling the condition the way we hoped." Claire swallowed. Her fingers tightened around each other. The doctor continued explaining. Additional damage, reduced function, increasing risk. The words arrived one after another. Medical language translated into simple reality, and the reality wasn't encouraging. Agnes found herself looking at Claire instead of the doctor, because the real story wasn't in the medical explanations. It was in Claire's face. The effort it took to remain calm, the effort it took not to break apart, the effort it took to keep listening. After several minutes, Claire finally asked the question she had been avoiding. "What happens now?" The doctor leaned forward slightly. "There are still options." The answer immediately changed the atmosphere. Not hope exactly, possibility, and right now possibility mattered. The doctor began outlining the next steps. Additional evaluations, specialized treatment plans, closer monitoring, potential procedures. Several paths remained available. None of them simple, none of them guaranteed, but they existed. Claire listened carefully, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking questions. Agnes noticed something remarkable. Even while discussing her own future, Claire remained practical, focused, determined. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wanted information, a plan, something she could hold on to. The conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes. By the end, the room felt emotionally exhausted. So did everyone inside it. When the doctor finally closed the folder, Claire released a breath she seemed to have been holding the entire time. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Claire managed a small smile. Not because she felt good, because sometimes courage looks a lot like refusing to panic. "Well," she said softly, "I've definitely had better afternoons." The attempt at humor wasn't strong, but it was enough. Agnes smiled despite herself. Even the doctor allowed a brief smile. Claire shook her head. "I was hoping for something slightly less dramatic." The smile faded quickly. Reality remained. Still waiting, still unavoidable. The doctor looked toward her. "There is one more thing we need to discuss." Immediately, the room became serious again. Claire noticed. Agnes noticed. The doctor chose his next words carefully, very carefully, because this part carried weight. Significant weight. "If the condition continues progressing at this pace." He paused briefly. "We may eventually need to explore donor options." The sentence landed heavily. Claire froze. Agnes felt her own stomach tighten. Nobody spoke. The doctor allowed the silence to exist, allowed them to absorb it. Because some information required space. Claire stared at the table, her expression completely still. The word donor echoed through the room long after it was spoken. Not because she didn't understand it, because she understood it perfectly. The conversation had moved beyond treatment, beyond medication, beyond monitoring, into territory she never wanted to enter. Eventually she looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're serious?" The doctor nodded. "We're not there today." A pause. "But we need to begin preparing for every possibility." Claire leaned back slowly. For the first time since Agnes had met her, she looked genuinely frightened. Not overwhelmed, not emotional, frightened, because suddenly the future felt uncertain in a way it never had before. The consultation eventually ended. The doctor left. The room grew quiet. Neither woman moved immediately. Claire stared at the floor, thinking, processing, trying to find solid ground beneath information that had changed everything. Agnes remained beside her, not speaking, not forcing comfort, just present. Sometimes that mattered more. Several minutes passed. Finally Claire laughed softly. The sound carried no joy, only disbelief. "You know," she shook her head. "A month ago I thought surviving the accident was the hard part." Agnes looked at her. Claire stared toward the window, the Dallas skyline glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Then she whispered something that stayed with Agnes long after they left the room. "I had no idea the real fight was just beginning, and somewhere deeper inside the hospital, conversations were already beginning about something neither woman was ready to face. Donors, testing, possibilities, choices. A new chapter had quietly opened, and none of them yet understood how personal it was about to become. The days following Claire's meeting with the doctor felt different. Not dramatic, not immediate, just different. The atmosphere around her had changed. Everyone could feel it. The nurses, the specialists, even Claire herself. Before, every conversation focused on recovery from the accident. Now the focus had shifted. Her heart, her future, the possibilities nobody wanted to discuss out loud. Claire returned to her hospital room carrying a folder full of information. Most of it remained unopened. She placed it on the bedside table and stared at it for nearly 10 minutes, as if reading it might somehow make everything more real. Agnes visited later that afternoon. Claire was sitting quietly by the window. The folder remained untouched. "You haven't opened it." Claire glanced toward the paperwork. "I know." Agnes pulled up a chair. "You probably should." Claire laughed softly. "That's exactly what everyone keeps saying." A brief silence followed. Then Claire looked out the window again. The humor faded. "I think I'm scared to." The honesty caught Agnes off guard, because Claire rarely admitted fear. Not openly, not directly, yet there it was, simple and real. For the first time in years, Claire was facing a problem she couldn't solve through determination alone, and that terrified her. The following week brought appointments, evaluations, meetings, tests, then even more tests. The process moved slowly. Medical decisions rarely happened overnight. Every possibility required information. Every option required preparation. Claire endured all of it, patiently, even when she was exhausted, even when she clearly wanted to go home. Meanwhile, Jeremy became increasingly restless. Agnes noticed it almost immediately. He checked his phone constantly, made more calls than usual, spent long periods sitting quietly, thinking. The change wasn't obvious to most people. It was obvious to Agnes. One evening she found him sitting alone in the backyard. The Texas sky was beginning to darken. The grill sat unused nearby. Normally Jeremy loved cooking outdoors. Tonight he wasn't touching it. He simply sat there, lost in thought. Agnes walked outside and took the chair beside him. Neither spoke at first. The silence felt familiar, comfortable, the kind married couples learn over time. Eventually Agnes broke it. "You're worried?" Jeremy smiled faintly. "That obvious?" "To me?" Agnes shook her head. "Very." Jeremy looked down, then toward the fence, then back toward the yard, searching for words, not finding them. Agnes watched him carefully. For the first time since this entire situation began, she could see how much emotional energy he had been spending behind the scenes. Not because he talked about it, because he didn't, because he carried it quietly, the way some people carried responsibility, the way some people carried guilt, the way some people carried love. Finally Jeremy sighed. "I keep wishing there was something I could fix." The statement sounded painfully honest. Agnes immediately understood. Because fixing things was what Jeremy did. Construction projects, broken appliances, home repairs, problems. He solved problems. That was how he moved through life. This situation refused to cooperate, and it was driving him crazy. Agnes reached for his hand. Jeremy squeezed hers gently. Neither said anything else. The conversation didn't need more words. The following afternoon, Agnes stopped by Jeremy's office. She rarely visited. Construction paperwork wasn't exactly exciting. But she happened to be nearby after work, and she wanted to surprise him with lunch. The office appeared empty. Several employees were still on job sites. Jeremy wasn't there yet. Agnes entered using the spare key he kept for emergencies. The food remained in her hands as she stepped inside. Then she noticed something, a stack of folders sitting on the desk. Normally she wouldn't have paid attention. Today she did, because one document had been left partially open. Her eyes caught a familiar word. Sale. Agnes frowned. She stepped closer, not intending to investigate. Not at first. Then she noticed another page, and another, and suddenly her pulse quickened. She slowly placed the food down, picked up the document, and started reading. Completely silent. Because the paperwork wasn't about construction. It wasn't about a project. It wasn't about a client. It was about Jeremy's company. More specifically, part of Jeremy's company. The documents outlined a potential sale, a substantial sale, large enough to change his finances significantly, large enough to affect his future. Agnes stared at the pages, confused. Jeremy had never mentioned any of this, not once. The more she read, the more concerned she became. Financial projections, asset evaluations, transfer estimates, everything appeared serious, everything appeared real. Then she found the note attached near the back. The note that explained everything, not directly, but enough. Future medical care planning. Agnes froze. Read it again. Then again. There was no misunderstanding, no confusion. Jeremy had been preparing to sell part of his company. Not for himself, not for business expansion, not for retirement, for Claire. The realization hit her hard. Because nobody knew. Not Claire, not the doctors, not Agnes. Nobody. Jeremy had quietly begun preparing for a future where Claire might need long-term medical support. And he was willing to sacrifice part of the business he spent years building, without recognition, without applause, without telling a single person. Agnes slowly sat down, the documents trembling slightly in her hands. She suddenly understood why Jeremy looked exhausted. Because while everyone else worried about possibilities, Jeremy was already preparing for them. Hours later, after returning to the hospital, Agnes couldn't stop thinking about what she had discovered. The image remained fixed in her mind. Jeremy making plans nobody requested, preparing sacrifices nobody expected, carrying burdens nobody knew existed. The evening passed quietly. Then another development arrived, one everyone had been waiting for, testing results. The first round of compatibility evaluations had finally been completed. Hospital staff moved carefully through the process. The situation remained sensitive, the possibilities remained uncertain, but progress was happening, slowly, methodically, one step at a time. Near the end of the day, a member of the medical team entered Claire's room holding a folder. Claire immediately sat straighter. Agnes noticed. So did Jeremy. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to, because they all understood. The results had arrived, and whatever was inside that folder was about to change everything. Nobody spoke. The folder sat on the edge of Claire's hospital bed. The member of the medical team remained standing nearby. Jeremy stood near the window. Agnes sat beside Claire, and suddenly the room felt much smaller than it actually was. Claire looked from face to face, then toward the folder. A nervous laugh escaped her. I really hate suspense. Nobody laughed, not because the joke wasn't funny, because everyone was too tense. Claire noticed immediately. The smile faded, slowly. The medical team member opened the folder, reviewed the paperwork one final time, then looked toward Claire. We've completed the first round of compatibility testing. Claire nodded. Her hands were clasped tightly together. Jeremy folded his arms. Agnes felt her heartbeat becoming impossible to ignore. The room remained silent. Then the results were finally spoken aloud. We found a compatible donor candidate. For one brief moment, relief entered the room. Not complete relief, but enough. Enough for everyone to breathe again. Enough for hope to appear. Claire immediately closed her eyes. The tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly. A compatible donor, a possibility, a chance. After everything she'd heard over the previous weeks, that alone felt like good news. Then the medical team member continued, and everything changed. The compatible donor candidate is Agnes. The room froze, completely, utterly. Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody reacted, because for several seconds nobody seemed capable of reacting. Claire stared. Jeremy stared. Agnes stared. The words had been spoken clearly. Yet none of them seemed able to process them. Finally Claire blinked, once, twice, then looked directly at Agnes. What? The single word barely escaped her mouth. Agnes couldn't answer. because she was still trying to understand what she had heard herself. The medical team member repeated the information, carefully, professionally, clearly. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding, no confusion. The testing showed compatibility. Agnes, out of everyone. Agnes. For several moments the room remained completely still. Then Jeremy slowly lowered himself into a chair, as if his legs suddenly stopped working properly. His eyes never left Agnes, not even for a second. Claire looked equally stunned, almost frightened. The emotion on her face shifted rapidly. Shock, disbelief, confusion. Then something else, something heavier, something far more emotional. Agnes finally found her voice. "Are you sure?" The question sounded small, almost childlike. The medical team member nodded. "We verified the results." Agnes swallowed. The room felt distant, like she was hearing everything from far away, because her brain had immediately jumped ahead, past the paperwork, past the testing, past the medical terminology, straight toward what it meant. Claire's future, her own future, the risks, the responsibilities, the consequences, all of it arriving at once. Nobody seemed to know what to say. The medical team member eventually excused himself, leaving the three of them alone. The moment the door closed, the silence returned, only heavier this time. Claire was the first to speak. "No," her voice trembled. "No." Agnes looked toward her. Claire immediately shook her head. "I can't." The words came quickly now, emotion breaking through. "I can't ask that. Claire, no." Tears filled her eyes, real tears, the kind people fight unsuccessfully. "I won't." Agnes stared at her, because this wasn't the reaction she expected. Claire wasn't relieved, she wasn't hopeful, she looked devastated, as though the possibility itself hurt. Jeremy finally spoke. His voice sounded rough. "Nobody is asking anything." Claire laughed through tears, a sad laugh. "You don't understand." She looked directly at Agnes. "I can't be responsible for that." Agnes didn't know how to respond, because honestly, neither could she. The situation felt impossible. Months ago she thought Claire was destroying her marriage. Now she might be able to save her life. Life had somehow taken the most unexpected path imaginable. The room grew quiet again. Jeremy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time since Agnes had met him, he seemed completely overwhelmed. Not because of money, not because of responsibility, because he loved both of these women, in different ways, for different reasons, and now both stood at the center of a decision nobody wanted. Eventually Claire wiped her eyes, then looked toward Agnes. "You don't owe me this." The statement came quietly, honestly. Agnes immediately believed her, because Claire wasn't trying to persuade anyone, she wasn't trying to influence the outcome, she was simply telling the truth. "You don't owe me anything." Agnes lowered her eyes. The words stayed with her, because deep down she already knew that wasn't really the question. The question wasn't what she owed. The question was what she could live with. And those weren't always the same thing. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Doctors answered questions. Risks were discussed. Recovery timelines, procedures, possibilities. Nobody rushed anything. Nobody pressured anyone. Every person involved understood the weight of the decision. When the meeting finally ended, evening had arrived. The Dallas skyline glowed beyond the hospital windows. Traffic lights flickered below. Life continued, completely unaware of the storm taking place inside one hospital room. Agnes eventually left alone. Jeremy offered to drive her home. She declined. Claire offered to talk. She declined that too. For the first time since this entire story began, she needed silence, real silence. The drive home passed in a blur. The radio remained off. The roads felt endless. Every thought led back to the same reality. Compatible. The word followed her everywhere. Compatible. Not possible, not maybe. Compatible. By the time she arrived home, darkness had settled across the neighborhood. The house felt unusually quiet. Jeremy hadn't returned yet, which was exactly what Agnes wanted. She kicked off her shoes, turned on a single lamp, and sat alone in the living room. The same room where she had once investigated bank statements. The same room where she had questioned her marriage. The same room where she had searched for betrayal. Now none of that seemed important, because a different question had replaced every other question, one far more difficult, one far more personal. Agnes sat there for hours, thinking, praying, remembering, trying to understand what her heart was telling her, trying to understand what her future might look like. Outside, the neighborhood grew quiet. Inside, the clock continued ticking. And long after midnight, Agnes remained alone with the decision that would change every life connected to hers, a decision she still wasn't ready to make. Agnes remained awake long after midnight. The house was quiet, the neighborhood was quiet, even the city beyond her windows seemed quieter than usual. Yet her mind refused to rest. The compatibility results kept replaying. Not because she didn't understand them, because she understood them perfectly. A choice now stood in front of her. A real choice. Not a theoretical one, not a distant possibility, a real decision that could affect multiple lives, and no amount of medical knowledge made that easier. She sat alone on the living room couch. One lamp illuminated the room, the same room where she had spent weeks questioning her marriage, the same room where she had searched through financial records, the same room where fear had convinced her she was losing everything. Now the room felt different, because the questions had changed, the fear had changed, everything had changed. Agnes leaned back and closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she stopped thinking about Claire. She stopped thinking about Jeremy. She stopped thinking about hospitals. Instead, she found herself thinking about home, not her house. Home, the place she grew up, the people who raised her, the voices that shaped her. Memories arrived quietly. A front porch, summer evenings, family cookouts, Sunday mornings, laughter, conversations, lessons that seemed ordinary at the time, lessons she suddenly needed. Her grandmother's voice appeared first, not as a memory of a specific day, just a familiar presence, a voice that somehow always knew when someone was carrying too much. Agnes smiled softly. Because her grandmother had never rushed to solve problems, she preferred asking questions, questions that forced people to look deeper, questions that stayed with them. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. Agnes couldn't have been older than 12. Someone in the neighborhood had spread a rumor. Nothing serious, just enough to hurt feelings. Agnes remembered being angry, certain she was right, certain someone else was wrong, certain she understood the entire situation. Her grandmother listened patiently, then asked one question. Did you hear the whole story? At the time, Agnes had rolled her eyes, because 12-year-olds rarely appreciate wisdom. Her grandmother simply laughed, then said something Agnes never forgot. Half a story can make a good person look bad. The memory lingered. Agnes slowly opened her eyes, because that lesson suddenly felt painfully familiar. Weeks ago she believed she knew the story, a patient, a husband, a secret. The evidence seemed obvious. The conclusion seemed obvious too. She had been wrong, not about everything, but about enough. The realization no longer embarrassed her, it humbled her. Agnes stood and walked toward the kitchen. The house remained dark except for the small light above the stove. She poured herself a glass of water, then stood quietly, thinking. Her grandmother had also believed in prayer, deeply, not the kind performed for appearances, the private kind, the honest kind, the kind people turned to when answers weren't available anywhere else. Agnes carried the glass into the dining room, sat down, folded her hands, and prayed. Not for a specific outcome, not for certainty, not even for courage. She prayed for clarity, for wisdom, for peace, for the ability to make the right decision for the right reason. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually the words stopped. The silence remained, yet something inside her felt calmer, not resolved, calmer. A different memory appeared, this one involving her mother. Years earlier, after a difficult day, Agnes remembered asking why her mother always helped people who couldn't repay her. The answer had seemed frustrating at the time. Now it felt important. You don't help people because they deserve it. Her mother had smiled. You help people because it's the right thing to do. Agnes lowered her eyes. The words settled heavily inside her, because suddenly the situation felt simpler than she had been making it. Not easier, simpler. She had spent days thinking about risk, responsibility, consequences, all important questions. Yet another question mattered too. What kind of person did she want to be? The answer arrived quietly, without drama, without fanfare. The answer had actually been growing inside her for weeks. From the moment she stopped seeing Claire as a threat, from the moment she started seeing her as a person, a woman, a mother, a survivor, someone who had fought through more hardship than most people could imagine, someone whose life mattered. Agnes sat quietly for a long time, then finally smiled, not because the decision was easy, because it was made. The next afternoon she returned to the hospital. Claire immediately noticed something different, not because Agnes said anything, because peace has a way of changing a person's face. Jeremy noticed it too. The three of them sat together. The atmosphere felt tense, expectant, nobody quite sure how to begin. Finally, Agnes broke the silence. I made my decision. Claire immediately looked down. Jeremy remained completely still. The room seemed to stop moving. Agnes took a slow breath, then looked directly at Claire. "I'm doing it." For several seconds, Claire didn't react, not because she didn't hear, because she couldn't process it. Then her eyes filled instantly. "No." The word escaped before she could stop it. Agnes smiled gently. "Yes." Claire shook her head. Again, and again, tears began falling freely. Not graceful tears, not quiet tears. The kind that arrive when emotions finally become too large to contain. She covered her face, trying unsuccessfully to regain control, trying unsuccessfully to speak. Agnes moved closer, placed a hand over hers. Neither woman spoke. They didn't need to, because in that moment something important happened. The fear that had started this entire story finally lost its grip, and compassion took its place. Claire lowered her hands, tears still falling, then whispered the only words she could manage. "Thank you." And for the first time since that phone call in the emergency room, both women felt the weight of the future begin to shift. The procedure wasn't scheduled immediately. Real life rarely moved that quickly. There were evaluations, more testing, consultations, paperwork, meetings, precautions. Every step mattered. Every detail mattered. And while the waiting frustrated everyone involved, it also gave them time. Time to prepare, time to think, time to process what was happening. For Agnes, those weeks felt strangely peaceful. Not easy, peaceful. The decision was behind her now. The uncertainty remained, the risks remained, but the decision itself was made. She no longer carried that weight. Claire, on the other hand, struggled with it every day, not because she doubted Agnes, because she couldn't stop thinking about the sacrifice. One afternoon, Agnes walked into Claire's room carrying a cup of coffee. Claire looked at it suspiciously. "What is that?" Agnes raised an eyebrow. "Coffee." Claire pointed dramatically. "That is not coffee." Agnes laughed. "It absolutely is." "No." Claire shook her head. "That is hospital coffee." The look of disgust on her face was so genuine that Agnes couldn't stop herself from laughing. Claire crossed her arms. "I've survived a car accident." A pause. "I've survived heart problems." Another pause. "But this?" She pointed at the cup again. "This is where I draw the line." Even Agnes had to admit she had a point. For a few minutes, both women laughed harder than either expected. The moment felt surprisingly normal. And normal had become valuable, because the reality surrounding them wasn't normal at all. The following weeks brought difficult days too. Days when Claire became overwhelmed. Days when medical appointments seemed endless. Days when fear returned unexpectedly. One evening, Agnes found Claire sitting quietly by the window. No television, no phone, no conversation, just silence, the kind people choose when they're trying to keep themselves together. Agnes sat beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Eventually, Claire broke the silence. "You ever notice how everybody keeps telling me to stay positive?" Agnes smiled slightly. "People mean well." "I know," Claire nodded. "But sometimes I don't feel positive." The honesty hung between them, simple, human, real. Agnes appreciated it, because courage wasn't pretending everything was fine. Sometimes courage was admitting it wasn't. Claire stared toward the city lights outside, then laughed softly. "I think I'm tired of being brave." Agnes immediately understood. The sentence wasn't weakness, it was exhaustion. Months of exhaustion. Years, probably. Without thinking, Agnes reached over and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to be brave every minute." Claire looked at her, then smiled, a small smile, but a genuine one. The procedure finally arrived on a cool morning several weeks later. The atmosphere inside the hospital felt different. Not because anyone said so, because everyone felt it. Agnes arrived early. Claire was already awake. Jeremy arrived shortly afterward. The three of them spent the next hour together, talking about completely random things, movies, food, terrible television shows, anything except the procedure, anything except the obvious. Nobody wanted their final conversation before surgery to revolve around fear. Eventually a nurse arrived. It was time. The room became quiet. Not dramatic, just quiet. Jeremy stood first, then Claire, then Agnes. Nobody seemed sure what to say. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Finally Jeremy cleared his throat. "I hate hospitals." Claire laughed. The tension immediately cracked. "You spend half your life in them." "Exactly." Jeremy nodded. "That's how I know." Even Agnes laughed. The moment wasn't perfect, but it was human, and sometimes human moments mattered most. The procedure went well. The first few days afterward were difficult. Recovery demanded patience, pain demanded patience, everything demanded patience. There were setbacks, small ones, the kind doctors warned about. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic. Still frustrating, still discouraging. One afternoon Claire became irritated because she couldn't move around as freely as she wanted. Another afternoon Agnes became frustrated because she felt stronger than the medical restrictions allowed. Jeremy somehow ended up mediating arguments between two stubborn women, a role he never expected and definitely never requested. One particular afternoon became legendary, at least according to Jeremy. Agnes and Claire disagreed about whose recovery instructions were more annoying. A ridiculous conversation, yet somehow it lasted nearly 20 minutes. Jeremy listened quietly, then finally raised both hands. "I'd like everyone to remember that neither of you is a doctor." Both women immediately turned toward him, at the exact same time. The look they gave him ended the conversation. Immediately, Jeremy raised his hands higher. "I apologize." Claire burst out laughing first. Agnes followed. Jeremy shook his head. "I don't know how I became the enemy." "Practice," Agnes replied. That earned another round of laughter. The weeks continued, then months. Slowly, steadily, progress appeared. More energy, more strength, more confidence. Not overnight, not magically, one day at a time, one step at a time, exactly the way healing often works. Eventually, hospital visits became less frequent, appointments became shorter, life gradually expanded again. And one bright Saturday afternoon, months later, Agnes found herself standing in a backyard surrounded by sunshine. Music played softly from a speaker. The smell of grilled food filled the air. Conversations drifted across the yard. Jeremy stood near the grill doing what he always did, acting as though barbecue required military-level concentration. Some things never changed. Agnes smiled as she watched him. Across the yard, Claire sat comfortably in a lawn chair, healthier, stronger, laughing more easily than she had in years. The difference was impossible to miss. For a moment, Agnes simply stood there, taking it all in, the recovery, the friendships, the second chances, everything. Then movement caught her attention. A small figure suddenly sprinted across the yard, fast, determined, focused on one destination. Claire immediately looked up. Agnes followed her gaze, and watched as Claire's son ran straight toward Jeremy. The little boy ran across the yard as fast as his legs could carry him, straight toward Jeremy, no hesitation, no uncertainty, no second thoughts. "Uncle Jeremy!" The words rang across the backyard, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jeremy looked up from the grill. A smile immediately appeared on his face, the kind that couldn't be faked, the kind that appeared automatically. The little boy wrapped his arms around Jeremy's waist. Jeremy laughed and hugged him back. "Easy there." The little boy ignored the warning completely. "I won." Jeremy raised an eyebrow. "You won what? A race?" "Against who?" The little boy pointed proudly toward the other side of the yard. "Everybody." Jeremy looked across the yard. There was nobody racing, not even close. Agnes laughed immediately. Claire covered her face. "Oh no." Jeremy nodded seriously. "An undefeated champion." The little boy grinned. "Exactly." Claire shook her head. "I have absolutely no idea where he gets this confidence." Jeremy looked directly at her. "Yes, you do." That earned laughter from nearly everyone nearby. Even Claire couldn't argue. Because it was true. The confidence was hers, the stubbornness too. And judging by the smile on her face, she knew it. The afternoon continued peacefully. Food disappeared from plates almost as quickly as Jeremy could cook it. Music drifted through the yard. Conversations overlapped. People laughed. People relaxed. The atmosphere felt warm, comfortable, alive. Agnes found herself standing near the edge of the yard, watching it all unfold. Months earlier, she could never have imagined this scene. Not in a million years. Because months earlier, she had been standing inside a hospital hallway convinced her marriage was collapsing. She remembered that moment clearly. The emergency contact form, the phone call, the shock, the fear. At the time, every piece of information seemed to point toward betrayal. Every discovery seemed to support the same conclusion. And the more she searched for evidence, the more convinced she became. Now she understood something important. Fear had been filling empty spaces, creating answers before the truth arrived. Building stories from incomplete information, stories that felt real, stories that felt convincing, stories that weren't true. A familiar arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. Agnes smiled before turning. "Jeremy," he handed her a plate. "You haven't eaten." Agnes looked down. He was right, again. "I've been busy," Jeremy laughed. "Watching people eat isn't the same as eating." Agnes accepted the plate. "Since when did you become observant?" Jeremy looked offended. "I've always been observant." Agnes stared at him. Jeremy stared back. Several seconds passed. Then both started laughing, because neither believed that statement, not even Jeremy. Across the yard, Claire was talking with several guests. The difference in her was impossible to miss. More energy, more color, more life. Recovery hadn't been easy. There had been difficult weeks, frustrating days, moments when progress felt slow, moments when exhaustion returned, moments when everyone questioned whether they were moving forward fast enough. But healing had arrived anyway, one day at a time, one step at a time, exactly the way most meaningful things arrive. Agnes watched Claire laugh at something one of the guests said. Then she watched Claire glance toward her son. The expression on her face said everything. Relief, gratitude, love, the opportunity to keep being present, the opportunity to keep being a mother, the opportunity to keep building a future. Agnes felt Jeremy squeeze her shoulder gently. Neither spoke. For a while they simply stood together, watching, appreciating, understanding. Finally, Jeremy broke the silence. "You okay?" Agnes looked up at him, a question he had asked many times throughout their marriage. This time the answer felt different. "Yeah," she smiled. "I really am." Jeremy nodded. No dramatic speech, no elaborate response, just a nod, the kind people share when they understand more than words can explain. The sun slowly began descending across the Dallas sky. Golden light stretched across the backyard. Conversation softened. Children continued playing. Music continued drifting through the air. The entire scene felt peaceful. The kind of afternoon people rarely appreciate while it's happening, the kind they remember years later. As the evening continued, Agnes found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The misunderstandings, the fear, the assumptions, the discoveries, the healing. All of it connected in ways she never expected. She once believed Claire was the greatest threat to her marriage, the woman she feared, the woman she questioned, the woman she nearly blamed for everything. Instead, Claire became something entirely different. A friend, a reminder, a lesson. Proof that people are rarely as simple as the stories we create about them. The truth had been sitting there all along, hidden beneath assumptions, hidden beneath fear, hidden beneath incomplete information. And once the truth finally emerged, it changed everything. Not because it erased the difficulties, because it revealed something more important. Compassion, trust, understanding, the qualities that actually hold people together when life becomes complicated. The little boy suddenly appeared again, running across the yard, still carrying enough energy for 3 people. He stopped directly in front of Jeremy. "Uncle Jeremy." Jeremy laughed. "Yes?" The little boy pointed toward the grill. "You're burning the burgers." Jeremy immediately turned around. "Wait, what?" The little boy burst into laughter and sprinted away. Jeremy looked at the grill, then looked back at everyone else. The burgers were perfectly fine. The entire yard erupted with laughter. Even Jeremy couldn't stop smiling. "That's not funny." Nobody believed him, least of all Agnes. As the laughter slowly faded and the evening continued, one final thought settled quietly inside Agnes's heart. Life had given her every reason to choose suspicion. Instead, it taught her the value of understanding. It showed her how quickly fear could distort reality, and how powerful truth could be once it finally arrived. Before this story ends, family, we'd love to hear from you. If this story touched you in any way, take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Mr. Gray Family if you enjoy stories filled with meaning, emotion, and lessons that stay with you long after the final scene. And don't forget to share this story with someone who might need the reminder, because sometimes the strongest lessons come from the stories we almost misunderstood. The greatest danger to Agnes's marriage was never another woman. It was the story fear kept telling her when she didn't yet know the truth.